The Subcommittee on Energy and Environment will come to order. Good afternoon. Welcome to today's hearing entitled Fostering Quality Science at EPA, Perspectives on Common Sense Reform. In front of you are packets containing the written testimony, biographies, and truth and testimony disclosures for today's witness panel. I now recognize myself for 5 minutes for an opening statement. I want to welcome everyone to this afternoon's hearing. This is the second in a series of hearings this subcommittee will be conducting to provide ideas and guidance to reform science at EPA. Unfortunately, the Environmental Research, Development, and Demonstration Authorization Act, or ERDA, which is the statute authorizing R&D at EPA, as well as the Science Advisory Board, was last reauthorized for fiscal year 1981. 30 years of congressional neglect and the aggressive and unjustified regulatory train wreck being pursued by this administration make the time ripe to evaluate reforms to environmental science at the agency. Many things have changed since 1981 that demand renewed congressional attention. Funds appropriated to EPA Science and Technology account have more than tripled from 1981 to 2010, and the agency's overall budget has ballooned to almost $9 billion. The agency now employs almost 18,000 people and maintains nearly 40 laboratories. According to the Office of Management and Budget, the overall effect of all major federal regulations in 1981 were a net cost savings of $1 billion. In contrast, in 2010, EPA's major rules alone represented over $23 billion in costs, a figure itself that many believe is a significant underestimate, and there have been disagreements as to the real benefits of these regulations. There are also very pragmatic reasons for us to be keenly interested in reforming and reauthorizing science activities at the EPA. Given the dire fiscal straits that our country is facing, programs, activities, and agencies that are operating under expired or outdated authorizations will have targets on their backs as we seek to get our budgetary house in order. In light of this, the right reforms to EPA R&D programs will not only improve trust in the science that informs regulatory decisions, it will also provide a framework to prioritize the most important functions and reduce unnecessary and wasteful spending elsewhere. For instance, despite 1.2 million examples of successful hydrofractured wells, the agency is moving forward with an unnecessary study in the area. Some basic questions need to be asked. What should the role of EPA be in conducting research? Should it be limited to fundamental research? Should R&D be limited to supporting the agency's regulatory agenda? What is the relationship between EPA's science and policy-making missions? And how do we prevent the politicizing of scientific activities? How can Congress best ensure regulatory science that is reliable, peer-reviewed, transparent, understandable, and objective? Are structural changes necessary to improve the quality and independence of the agency's scientific advisory bodies? And do we have our environmental priorities right? And are we getting the most environmental bang for our buck? This hearing follows up on testimony received 2 weeks ago from officials at the EPA's Office of Research and Development, Office of the Inspector General, and the Government Accountability Office. Furthermore, in order to build a substantive record, this is actually the 9th hearing on science and process at the EPA that this committee has held so far in the 112th Congress. The committee has also sent a series of letters to EPA and the administration requesting further information about policies on transparency, cost-benefit analysis, and peer review. Unfortunately, we're still waiting for responses to 4 letters sent since September. Reforming environmental science should not be a partisan issue, as a 2009 report by the Bipartisan Policy Center's Science for Policy Project, co-chaired by the former chair of the Full Science Committee, Sherry Baylor, explained, quote, a tendency to frame regulatory issues as debates solely about science, regardless of the actual subject in dispute, is at the root of the stalemate and acrimony all too present in the regulatory system today, end quote. The report went on to recommend that Congress should include their recommendations, quote, in legislation as relevant programs are reauthorized, end quote, including suggesting the studies used in developing regulations should be subject to data access requirements. Agencies and advisory bodies should be transparent in their approach to evaluating and weighing studies, and that agencies should explicitly differentiate between scientific judgments and policy judgments. These are reasonable core principles that I hope both sides can agree upon, and which will advance fulfillment of the President's executive order requiring that, quote, our regulatory system must be based on the best available science. The diverse set of witnesses with us today will offer their views on these and other EPA scientific reform ideas and offer recommendations for improving and clarifying environmental R&D priorities. I hope these suggestions will highlight some potential avenues for bipartisan cooperation as our subcommittee continues its work on these issues. Again, I want to thank all the witnesses for appearing before the subcommittee, and I look forward to a constructive discussion. The Chair now recognizing Mr. Miller, the ranking member, for 5 minutes for an opening statement.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I appreciate your accommodating me by beginning slightly early this afternoon to allow me to cast votes in the Financial Services Committee. And I would also like to make this committee's efforts in rewriting the authorization statute to be a bipartisan effort. I appreciate your willingness to work with us to try to make future hearings more useful to the committee in informing that important work. Today, the subcommittee meets again for Part 2 of the EPA Research and Science series of hearings. The first hearing 2 weeks ago was disappointing and a missed opportunity. The stated purpose of the hearing a couple of weeks ago was to examine the ability of EPA's research enterprise to meet the agency's mission to protect public health and the environment. However, many of my colleagues decided instead to use their time to focus on EPA's hydraulic fracturing study rather than on that stated purpose. I believe the goal of this series of hearings should be to establish a useful committee record to prepare to write legislation to reauthorize the Environmental Research, Development, and Demonstration Authorization Act, ERDA. Today's hearing does not appear to be any more likely to inform the committee about structural and substantive concerns of stakeholders related to EPA's research activities. It is not a balanced, comprehensive, or even helpful hearing. This hearing looks like what we are seeing on the House floor this week, a platform for anti-regulation, anti-science talking points. And as I said a couple of weeks ago, I hope that my Republican counterparts are truly interested in reform that will lead to better research to enhance public health and protect the environment. Although we all agree that there are legitimate concerns related to EPA's research enterprise, this hearing doesn't really help us understand or address those issues. The agency's scientific research is important as more complex environmental issues emerge and evolve that need to be understood and addressed. Scientific research, knowledge, and technical information are fundamental to EPA's mission and inform its standard setting, regulatory, compliance, and enforcement functions. That is why Congress saw fit to create advisory bodies at EPA's like the Clean Air Scientific Advisory Committee, which was created to provide independent advice on the science and allow the administrator to make regulatory decisions. I really hope today that we would have a productive conversation about how best to position the EPA to perform that mission of protecting human health and the environment. And if we are really serious about working towards reauthorizing ERDA, which does need to be done, as the chairman said, after 30 years, perhaps it is wise to revisit that statute. We must establish a committee record that will offer us a wide range of views on how best to draft legislation that would serve the agency better, as well as the people that we all represent. If that is the case, I hope that we can commit to working together after today to put together hearings and panels that will serve that purpose. And with that, Chairman Harris, I yield back.
Thank you very much, Mr. Miller. If there are members who wish to submit additional opening statements, your statements will be added to the record at this point. At this time, I'd like to introduce our witness panel. Again, I want to thank you for your patience. We had for the slightly late start. Our first witness today is the Honorable Susan Dudley, Director of the Regulatory Studies Center and a Research Professor of Public Policy and Public Administration at the George Washington University. From April 2007 through January 2009, Professor Dudley served as the presidentially appointed administrator of the Office of Information and Regulatory Affairs in the U.S. Office of Management and Budget. The next witness will be Dr. Alan Moghissi, the president of the Institute for Regulatory Science. Previously working for EPA, Dr. Moghissi managed numerous programs, including the Bioenvironmental Radiological Program at the National Environmental Research Center in Las Vegas, the Health and Environmental Risk Analysis Program in Washington, D.C. He was also Principal Science Advisor for Radiation and Hazardous Materials and represented the Office of Research and Development in a number of work groups responsible for drafting environmental regulations. The next witness is Dr. Kenneth Green, a resident scholar at the American Enterprise Institute. Dr. Green has studied public policy and regulation at free enterprise think tanks across North America for nearly 20 years. An environmental scientist by training, Dr. Green focuses on policy and regulations involving energy and environmental health. And the final witness today is Dr. Gary Marchant, Professor of Law and Executive Director of the Center for Law, Science, and Innovation at Arizona State University. Prior to joining the ASU faculty in 1999, he was a partner in the Washington, D.C. law firm Kirkland & Ellis, where his practice focused on regulatory issues. Thank you all for appearing before the subcommittee today. As our witnesses should know, spoken testimony is limited to 5 minutes each, after which the members of the committee will have 5 minutes each to ask questions. I now recognize our first witness, Ms. Susan Dudley, Director of the Regulatory Studies Center and a Research Professor of Public Policy and Public Administration at the George Washington University. Ms. Dudley.
Thank you, Chairman Harris, Ranking Member Miller, and members of the subcommittee. As you mentioned, I'm at GW, but my remarks here today are my own. EPA regulations are often the subject of heated debate involving accusations of politicized science and advocacy science. While it's legitimate to be wary of policy officials and politicians trying to influence scientific studies, more often than not, these debates center on issues that science can inform but not decide. And I'm actually going to read a quote from the Bipartisan Policy Center report that the chairman mentioned. In fact, you read the same quote, but I'm going to repeat it again. This is the Bipartisan Policy Center report, Improving the Use of Science in Regulatory Policy. A tendency to frame regulatory issues as debates solely about science, regardless of the actual subject in dispute, is at the root of the stalemate and acrimony all too present in the regulatory system today. And I do highly recommend that report. I think it does show that these issues are not partisan. Framing issues as debates solely about science is problematic for two reasons. First, while science is essential for understanding the positive question of what is, it's less helpful for the normative policy question of what should be. Sound policy decisions depend not only on scientific assessments of risk, but also on other factors such as economics, ethics, law, and yes, politics, the will of the people. Second, scientists will never have complete information to predict outcomes with absolute certainty. So even the risk assessment, as opposed to the risk management phase of an analysis, depend on assumptions and judgments that guide the use of scientific information. Policymakers and the public are often unaware of the influence of these risk assessment policy choices or the existence of alternative assessments that are equally plausible. Instead, assessments often generate precise-sounding predictions that hide considerable uncertainty about the actual risk and are heavily influenced by hidden judgments about what policies should look like. Institutional arrangements in the regulatory development process tend to aggravate these problems, perpetuating the charade that policies are based purely on science, insulating experts involved in a particular rulemaking from dissenting views, reinforcing preconceptions, biases, and leading to regulatory policy decisions that are not at all transparent. So, as the committee evaluates approaches to address perceived problems in the quality of EPA science, it's important to identify whether the source of the problem is politicians attempting to control science, or the politicization of science, or scientists attempting to control policy. And that's something that David Goldston, who was part of the executive director of the Bipartisan Policy Center project on this, and now at NRDC, he calls that the scientification of policy. My own experience supports the Bipartisan Policy Center's conclusion that the latter problem is behind much of the controversy related to science-based regulation. So with that in mind, let me offer 3 modest recommendations. 1, recognize that science is a positive discipline that can inform but not decide appropriate policy. Avoid the temptation to delegate decisions to agencies on the pretense that science alone can make the normative decision of what the policy should be. And I was going to quote again from the Bipartisan Policy Center report, but I won't in the interest of time. My second recommendation is to recognize that risk assessment necessarily involves assumptions and judgments, as well as pure scientific inputs, and establish procedures and incentives to make more transparent risk assessment inputs and the range of plausible outcomes. The National Academies of Science have offered numerous recommendations in this regard for improving the quality and transparency of EPA risk assessment, including in its recent report earlier this year on the formaldehyde IRIS process. And my final recommendation is to increase the robustness of regulatory science by institutionalizing feedback mechanisms along with checks and balances. The scientific method depends on falsifiable hypotheses, data gathering, dissent, and challenge to ensure objective analysis to minimize bias in the interpretation of results. Now, no one is truly objective, so institutional reforms that engage and encourage competing views could go a long way to improve the clarity of the risk assessment process and the decisions that depend on scientific input. President Obama has taken some positive steps in this regard, reinforcing interagency review and calling for more open exchange with the public. Other successful reforms might involve pre-rulemaking disclosure of risk assessment information to engage broad public comment on the proper choice of studies, models, assumptions, etc., long before any policy decisions are framed and positions are set in stone. And with 1 second left, I'll stop. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I now recognize our second witness, Dr. Alan Moghissi, the President of the Institute for Regulatory Science.
Chairman Dr. Harris, Ranking Member Miller, members of the subcommittee. As Chairman said, my name is Alan Moghissi, and I'm the President of Institute for Regulatory Science. We are a not-for-profit organization established in 1985, and we are in Alexandria, Virginia. We are dedicated to the idea that societal decisions, notably environmental regulations, must be based on what we call best available science. And Mr. Chairman, you used that term, and that was music to my ear. And we defined best available science. If you go to our website at www.nars.org, you find a fundamental description of BAS. My testimony to do is based on that. However, what I'm doing today is my personal interpretation of BAS rather than official pronouncement of the Institute for Regulatory Science. Although the term regulatory science is used extensively in the interest of transparency, let me define it again. Regulatory science consists of the scientific foundation of policy, notably regulatory decisions. It's the science part of the subject rather than societal implications of the regulatory side. Based on this definition, the scientific activity of the EPA are overwhelmingly regulatory science. I appreciate the opportunity to testify before your committee, and I'm proposing the Congress to enact the Regulatory Science Sunshine Act. Regulatory Science Sunshine Act as a segment of the EPA authorization appropriation or as a separate act. My written testimony includes metrics for evaluation of regulatory science information and regulatory science ethics. My apologies that I cannot describe them because I needed more than 1 hour to do so, and I have only 5 minutes. Please note that the regular science information, at best in the metrics that I included, partially reproducible evolving science, and often at lower maturity, going all the way to down to scientific judgment or even speculation. A characteristic of the class I just described, a partially reproducible evolving science, is that although its foundation is proven science and uncontested, it often uses, as my colleague on the right side described, assumptions, judgment, default data and values, if the relevant data and values are unavailable, and most unfortunately, as Mr. Chairman pointed out, on occasion it uses societal judgment that are outside the purview of science. The proposed Regulatory Science Sunshine Act would require that within the R&D program of EPA makes a concerted effort to develop procedures, processes, and method for each regulatory science, a regulatory decision that is based on includes science. 1, identification of assumptions, judgment, default data, any other similar system used in the regulatory process, identification of potential alternatives, and how the conclusions would be different if an alternative assumption, judgment, and similar parameters are used. 2, description of the content of all mathematical equations in words. 3, information identified above must be written in a language that is understandable to knowledgeable non-specialist, or better yet, to an average person. Clear and unambiguous justification for the inclusion of societal objective in science rather than addressing societal objectives in the administrative decision process. And obligation of EPA to comply with the ethical requirement of regulatory science. I'm a proud charter member of the EPA and believe that EPA has done an outstanding job in protecting human health and the environment. However, I would be less than frank if I would not express my concern over certain decisions that have had adverse societal, including environmental consequences. There are those within the regulatory science community who believe that members of the other scientific disciplines, and certainly the general public, would have difficulties understanding the complex nature of scientific in the regulations. They are wrong. They are dead wrong. Quoting Thomas Jefferson, as did my boss, Ruckelshaus, if we think the people are not enlightened enough to exercise their control with a wholesome discretion, the remedy is not to take it away from them, but to inform their discretion. Thank you much.
Thank you very much.
Just a second.
I now recognize our third witness, Dr. Kenneth Green, a resident scholar at the American Enterprise Institute.
Thank you. Chairman Harris, Ranking Member Miller, members of the subcommittee. Thank you for inviting me to testify today. I am, as the chairman said, Kenneth Green, a resident scholar at the American Enterprise Institute. I'm a biologist and environmental policy analyst by training, and I've studied public policy with a science component for about 20 years now, mostly at nonprofit and nonpartisan public policy research institutions across North America. My testimony represents only my views and should not be associated or construed as an official position of anybody else. And my spoken testimony is an abstract from the written testimony I submitted, which is a little bit lengthier, and I wouldn't have time for it today. For the sake of complete disclosure, I want to mention that verbally what I submitted in my truth and testimony form, I've served as a grant reviewer for the U.S. EPA on 3 or 4 occasions and was paid their customary per diem for participating in such reviews in 2008 and 2009. Other than offering my judgment on the quality and soundness and relevance of potential grant proposals, I had no other involvement with the award process, nor any involvement, to my knowledge, with any grant recipients or applicants in any way. In fact, I'd like to take a second to compliment EPA on the rigor of the process they use to evaluate these outside grant proposals and innovative grant requests. I was quite impressed with the level of rigor and discipline involved in analyzing the proposals, ranking them, discussing them, the knowledgeability of the panelists, and so forth, and I commend that process. I wish I could say that all of EPA's science-related activities were equally satisfying to think about, but unfortunately I can't. Both my own research and reading in literature suggests that EPA has serious problems in the ways that it employs scientific information when it assesses both the potential benefits and potential costs of existing and proposed public policies. As is common in the public health community, EPA's science culture seems highly risk-averse, so much so that when confronted with a range of possible risks, they tend to accept assumptions and design protocols, analytical protocols, and frameworks in ways that lead to ever greater estimations of health risk from ever lower levels of exposure to environmental pollutants. This is sometimes referred to simply as being conservative or precautionary. And in the medical context, that can be beneficial, and indeed nobody wants the agency to blithely dismiss risks. But when such artificially elevated risk estimates are translated into economic estimates of regulatory benefit and cost and used to prioritize agency efforts and activities, the product is increasingly costly regulations that do increasingly little good, or worse, in some cases actually impose costs to society greater than the benefits that they produce. That's where things diverge from a harmless precautionary exercise into poor public policy, and I think it is a serious problem. Without a sound understanding of the proposed benefits and costs of regulations, it is impossible to have a rational public policy development process. It is also difficult for agencies without that to determine their regulatory priorities. Thus, even where an agency's proposals might do more harm than good, they can't optimally bring their resources to bear where they can do benefit to secure the biggest bang for the regulatory dollar without wasting public revenues, public resources. My own experience with EPA is partly back in 1997 when I was looking at the National Ambient Air Quality Standards, and I noticed some of the problems with the way EPA handles risk assessment. While EPA, on one hand, was saying that, well, if we reduce, we want to stop the reduction of high-level ozone in the atmosphere because that ozone protects people from cataracts and skin cancer. They did not want to account for that same phenomenon when they said they want to reduce ozone in lower levels of the atmosphere. And yet the reduction in ozone would have the same effect. So they didn't want to net out the benefits and possible harms of the regulation. And that was pointed out by others, and I think eventually was discussed in the Supreme Court, that you have to do a net assessment of health and of risks and benefits. Others have documented bigger problems. Garrett Vaughn in 2006 examined EPA's claims about the benefits and costs of their air quality regulations and observed that EPA's estimate of having saved the country some $22 trillion through public health protection from 1970 to 1990 would, if accurate, roughly equal the aggregate net worth of all U.S. households in 1990. Vaughn pointed out that EPA's claims net benefits equal to nearly 3 times the profits of all U.S. corporations and a return on capital by the EPA regulations of 500%. Comparing to a 7% rate of return on investment in the private sector. Economist Dan Smith testified recently to this subcommittee, one associated and interesting effect of EPA's benefits inflation is the degree to which it makes the total number of deaths attributable to particulates implausible. EPA's presumption that fully 320,000 deaths in the United States were due to particulate matter in 2005 represents over 13% of all deaths in the United States on average. Behind this average is a presumption that in large expanses of the eastern U.S., between 16 and 22% of all deaths in 2005 were due to particulate matter. The distortions go on, and I could continue, but I'm running out of time. I'm sure we all agree that protecting the environment is very important. Having grown up with asthma myself in the San Fernando Valley in California, the smog capital of North America at the time, I'm very aware of the role that poor air quality can play in determining one's quality of life. But I hope we also agree there's no benefit in overprotection, and there's no benefit in misallocation of resources, and there's no benefit in the misdirection of attention to small risks at the expense of large risks, which we face elsewhere in the economy, and that getting the science right is important. EPA's use of science tends to overestimate the risks humans face, I believe, and underestimate the cost of compliance with regulations leading to poor public policy development. With that, I look forward to your questions. Thank you very much.
Thank you. I now recognize our fourth and final witness, Dr. Gary Marchant, Professor of Law and Executive Director of the Center for Law, Science, and Innovation at Arizona State University.
Great. Thank you, Mr. Chairman Harris and Ranking Member Miller and members of the committee. I'm delighted to be here. My name is Gary Marchant. As said, I'm a law professor at ASU. And I direct our Center for Law, Science, and Innovation, which we bill ourselves as the oldest and largest academic center in the country looking at the intersection of law with science and technology. And one of the major issues we focus on is to try and improve the use of science in various types of legal institutions and decision-making, including regulatory agencies. I'm delighted to be here. I really want to make 2 points today. The first one is the importance of science in our environmental regulatory decision-making has never been higher, both from the demand and supply side. From the demand side, that the easy problems in environmental policy have been addressed, the things we can smell and see with our own eyes and ears and nose. We've pretty much dealt with those problems. The problems we have left are much more subtle, much more long-term, and they really require science to tell us the answers. We're not going to tell with our own senses. We can't tell as individuals what's the problem of what we're exposed to. We really need science to tell us that. So science from a demand side has never been in greater need. And then from the supply side, we have a lot of new science methods coming forward today of toxicogenomics and biomarkers and models to model ecosystem effects and so on. So we're getting a lot of new scientific methods coming into our environmental policy world as well. And the combination of those two, I think, have made science really critical more than ever before in how we do environmental policy making. Now, 2 caveats about that. One is, as Ms. Dudley has mentioned, science can't answer the question. Science is an extremely important input in our environmental decision making, but the decisions that EPA has to make are, at the end, normative. They incorporate science, but a lot of other factors as well. And the second point is that science is always going to have uncertainty. You know, there's always going to be things we don't know in science that's inherent to science. And so it's almost as important for scientists and science to tell us what we don't know as much as we do know, so that the decision makers at EPA and elsewhere can make informed decisions based on that uncertainty. That's inherent to their decision making. So my second point is that the context and the institutional environment in which science is dealt with really matters. Science has these norms of how it works in and of itself, of objectivity, of neutrality, of looking at the data and making our decisions based on the data, not on personal values and interests and so on. And because scientists are humans, we never get that perfectly right. But there's different ways in which science is done in different institutional contexts that make a big difference. And if you don't believe me, just go into a courtroom these days and watch how science is delivered there. It's completely adversarial, and you're not getting the way science is supposed to be done there. You're getting the two hired guns on opposite extremes. What you need is a type of process that encourages sort of the consensual way that science works best. And when it's done in an adversarial or politicized environment, it doesn't work as good as it should. And so you get two kinds of problems. You get a blending of science and policy, the two overlap, and it's hard to draw the lines, what Wendy Wagner's called the science charade, often where agencies will explain a decision as a scientific decision that involves a lot of science, but also involves some normative decisions that should also be expressly recognized. And the second one is you get both conscious, but even more importantly, subconscious changing your view on the science based on the policy preferences of the organization you're in. So I think both of those are problems that EPA faces, because the EPA is at root a very political and policy organization. I don't mean that in a derogatory mean. They have to be that way. They're making these complex decisions that involve science, but also politics and policy and values and all kinds of different factors. And they have to work in that sort of messy world. But it's not a good world for science. And so the idea I'd like you to consider is the idea of creating some kind of separate institution to deal with the science. This was brought up way back in the 80s, and the so-called Red Book, the National Academy of Science, considered that. Said it's important to separate the science and the policy, but didn't agree we should put them in separate institutions. But what I would like to suggest is that it might be time to re-examine that, to put the science in a separate organization. I've written a couple articles. I suggest something called an Institute for Scientific Assessments that would basically do these type of assessments in a neutral organization that runs on a scientific model rather than a more policy-type model. And from the bottom to the top, from the DNA of that organization, it works on the scientific model. And I think there's a couple of really good examples of that we can look at. The Health Effects Institute here in the United States. Europe created something called the European Food Safety Authority that works that same way. And both of those organizations inculcate sort of scientific values at top to bottom. And the result is a product coming out of them is respected across the board. And so if we can do that, we can start with this baseline of what science can tell us and what it can't, and then we can go from there and make our political and policy decisions. And if we can do that, I think we end up with both good science and good regulation. Thank you.
Thank you very much for your testimony, and we'll start the round of questions. The reminding members committee rules limit questioning to 5 minutes. The chair will, at this point, will open the round of questions. I recognize myself for 5 minutes. Dr. Marchant, by the way, that's an excellent point. In medicine, we have the NIH to do the research. Totally separate, about as non-politicized as you get. And then, of course, the information is public and can be interpreted whatever way it needs to be interpreted. Ms. Dudley, one thing that's kind of bothered me about some of the science that's presented, because we've had science used as justification for policy decisions, and phrases such as, well, you would save up to 300,000 cases of asthma a year if only you lowered this particulate matter standard or mercury standard or some co-benefit or whatever. And as a scientist, if I ever made a presentation at a scientific meeting and in my results section I said up to something, I'd be laughed off the stage. They want the mean, they want the standard error, the mean, standard deviation, whatever. But with something like that, I've only been here a year. I wasn't here at the last round of reductions in pollution, but I'll bet you the claim was made that if only we reduce that pollution, asthma will go down by hundreds of thousands of cases a year. And of course, we all know asthma hasn't gone down. It's gone up. So do you think that more of the agency science funds should go actually toward retrospective research to figure out whether EPA regulations in the past, what the exact impact has been, and whether they've accomplished their environmental and health goals? Because I bet you we go look at some claims made 10 years ago about the incidence of asthma, if only we could reduce pollution, and we'd be very surprised by the lack of result.
I think that's a very interesting proposal. I think one thing that is lacking is the feedback mechanism. I think that's an intriguing proposal. I think one of the reasons it may be hard to do is that even though there are large benefits, and we would all recognize there are large benefits, they still may not be observable in the number of asthma cases. For example, with reducing the levels of lead, we've observed tremendous reductions in lead. So we've reduced lead in the atmosphere, we've reduced it in children's blood, and yet we still, and the reason that we do all that is because there's a real link between child blood levels and IQ, and yet even though we've done tremendous things, we can't measure that change in IQ, even with huge changes in lead levels. So it's hard, but I think it's certainly worth doing. I think it's a very intriguing idea.
Okay. Dr. Marchant, you had said that, that one of the problems is that you would change, you might change your view of, if you blend two things in agency, you change your view of science based on policy preference. Now, I got to tell you, we've had testimony from the head of research at EPA about, outlining, for instance, the need for hydrofracturing research to figure out if it's safe. And I asked them at the last panel, I said, look, there have been 1.2 million applications of a hydrofracturing, 0 incidences of documented drinking water contamination. Now, a scientist would say, wearing my hat as my old profession as a physician, we applied to therapy 1.2 million times and it was good and it didn't have an adverse consequence. We'd call it a miracle drug and would sell it everywhere around the world. Here, the EPA scientist says, no, we have to study the safety of it. Is that one instance where perhaps if you had separated the science from the policy preference, you might have a cleaner scientific method or justification for scientific projects?
Possibly. I'm not an expert on that particular issue, but I think it's just human nature that when you're working for an organization that has a policy mission, which EPA does, that your view of the world is affected by that. Just like when I was a practicing lawyer, it's affected by what client I work for. My view of the issue is changed when I start working for a client. It's just a fundamental matter of human nature, and so I might deliberately skew my views to favor my institution, my employer, but even more subtle, which I think a lot of good scientists will have happen to them, even though they try not to have their view intentionally skewed, would be this implicit, this subconscious way of how you look at the world, affected by your organization you're in. And so if your organization is one that says, all we want to know is what the science tells us, we don't care about the policy, you might get a different answer than one that very much has an important policy.
Yeah, thank you. Dr. Moghissi, do you think the EPA's the Scientific Federal Advisory Committee, standing committees, ad hoc panels should be recommending policy decisions in addition to advising on scientific or technical issues, or should there be a firewall between that?
I believe it should be a firewall. As you can see from my accent, I wasn't born in Alexandria, Virginia. And believe me, where I come from, I recall I was too young during the Second World War, but there was a number of exceptionally competent scientists who were, when it came to policy issues or came to the societal issues, were frankly stupid. Johannes Stark was a Nobel Prize winning. There's a Stark effect in physics, one of the most important ones, and he was a Nazi. How do you explain that? I believe there's a place for science and there is a place for policymakers. And I believe it would be a bad idea to mix them.
Okay, thank you. Let me just ask one last quick question, Dr. Green. Testimony, I recall testimony, I think it was one panel or two ago, that every dollar spent on regulation, we've got $40 in benefit, economic benefit. I just suggested, well, it's simple. Let's just spend $1 trillion and pay off our debt and then gain some to that. Do you think part of the problem is that, again, because the testimony in front of the committee in the past has been, well, you're going to save up to $300,000 of this or up to $10,000 of this, and I don't know what the range is. Maybe the range of the real science was you actually might lose lives, to save lives. I don't know. Where are they getting these estimates of $30, $40? I mean, how do they come up with something? Because when I talk to business people, they know the real cost of regulation. And they say, no, there is a real cost to these regulations. And yet there's this disparity between what the two opposing philosophies believe, that regulation costs a lot or regulation saves us a lot.
Well, I think you ask an important question, and you use an important word, which is estimates. These are estimates of lives saved and estimates of illness averted. And increasingly, as others have pointed out, including Ann Smith, who's testified for your subcommittee and me in the past, EPA bases these estimates on what are called willingness to pay surveys, in which they ask people, what would you pay to avoid losing a day at work because your lungs are too tight? What would you pay to not have a case of bronchitis or to not have a case of lung cancer? And the problem is these willingness to pay surveys, not only do they not make sense when they compare to each other, the valuations you get from them are often nonsensical. The literature on willingness to pay surveys specifically says that they really are not indicators of what people would actually pay in the real world. And so you're using a methodology that you know is not going to get you what you want, but representing it as if somebody has actually been challenged to pay. What would you pay? And would you pay more to avoid cancer than you would bronchitis? Well, logically, you'd say yes, but some of these willingness to pay surveys don't necessarily bear that out.
Sure. Thank you very much. And I now recognize Mr. Miller and give you a couple extra minutes here.
Don't worry about it overly much, Mr. Chairman. I'm puzzled by the testimony. I think I agree with the fundamental idea that science should not be the only criteria. It should inform decisions, that policymakers will apply the information that comes from science, the ways in which science informs policy, but then there are other criteria, other considerations that come into effect. But what I did not really get from your testimony is how does that then happen? Ms. Dudley said that she didn't think that the agency should make the decision. The EPA has criteria set by Congress, passed by statute. We are policymakers. Our names actually appear on ballots. It's right in the Constitution, Article 1, and it sets out how to decide what the criteria are, and then apply science to those statutory criteria and reach a result. If not the agency, who and on what basis? Ms. Dudley?
I didn't mean to say that agencies shouldn't make a decision. I'm not sure what I said that led you to suggest that. I certainly think that agencies should make a decision as delegated under the constraints delegated from Congress. My recommendation was that when you delegate authority to agencies, don't do so under the pretense, I'm not accusing you personally, obviously, but don't delegate authority as if a decision can be made solely based on science. Allow the agency to consider, to be able to separate the science from a policy decision and base the policy on the range of factors that are relevant for making policy.
But those factors should be set out in statute, right? I mean, they should be decided by Congress and then applied by the agency. Isn't that the way you think it should proceed? By
Congress and applied by the executive branch. Certainly.
Okay.
And so my recommendation to you was, when delegating to agencies, recognize that there are two parts to, actually there are three things to think of. One is the pure science, then there's the risk assessment that brings together those different assumptions and judgments. Make that transparent and separate that from the policy decision.
Okay, I really did not hear from anyone's testimony how to coordinate science and research at the EPA so that it neither creates a bias against regulation or for regulation. How do we make sure that it provides useful, detached information that policymakers who wish to apply all the proper criteria can rely upon? I did not really hear that. I know that you have an hour-long presentation, Doctor.
No. My apologies if I wasn't clear.
Okay.
It's the responsibility of the scientists to say that's what the science says, and the chairman brought it up. He said up to so much, blah, blah, blah. What do you mean up to so much? What is the scientists, we have a statistical process. Right. There's a middle point, there's the upper 95 percentiles, that's the lower 5 percentiles. The task of the scientists said this is the science. The administrator and Ruckelshaus was good at it. You go to the public and say, me, the administrator, based on the authority provided to me by Congress, I'm taking this number, and that is my decision. The hearing process, as you will know, is a little more complicated than make it to be. In fact, it is, you have to have announced it on 30 days and so on and so forth. But he went and said that there was a famous hearings in some place I think in Seattle or in Tacoma, in which he exactly did that. This is the science. My conclusion from the science is that is the decision. Like it or not, that's my decision.
Any of you really want to address how that in statute we can revise the ERDA statute to make sure that we get science that does not have a bias one way or the other? Dr. Green, and the bias should also not be anti-regulatory.
I agree, and far be it for me to tell you how to do your job. I'm not a legislator and never have been.
That's actually what the people at that table do all the time. That is your job right now.
I will eschew the activity myself. What I would say is there are some problems with transparency that have been mentioned before, and transparency and timeliness. One issue I could suggest, for example, when EPA does regulatory impact analyses. I remember in the 1997 revisions to the National Ambient Air Quality Standards, the regulatory impact analysis was not final until after the rules were passed and written. Therefore, there really was no opportunity for an outside analysis of whether or not you'd be getting the right return on investment. That should not be allowed. I don't see where you can allow a draft regulatory impact assessment to be the only assessment available before passing something of such far-reaching consequences. So a suggestion that greater transparency and slowing things down. I mean, if you look at the length of the regulations we're getting and the complexity levels, as was mentioned earlier, the really easy stuff, getting the photochemical smog out of the air, the things you could see, that's done. The things we're working on now are much more complicated, and yet the regulatory process has gotten compressed by timelines that are very tight and make it very hard to review. And also there are burdens or obstacles being placed in people who do the reviews. It's not a career-building activity for you to participate in reviews for the agency, especially when you have to drop everything to scramble to evaluate a rule that's put out the evening before Thanksgiving weekend, which is all too frequently the case as well.
Okay. Using my last minute of my extended time, we will have additional hearings on this subject. We have the majority and the minority have been in conversation, have been in discussions about how to have a balanced panel that will present views on how to amend the statute, how to revise a statute that's been on the books for 30 years now, and who should be at that table to present the proper range of views. I mean, obviously, for various reasons, this panel is of one mind, but there are certainly other points of views, and who should be at that table to present the proper range of views for future hearings.
Can I just say, I don't think we're of one mind, but I think that it's important to separate out two different issues here. So I'm not really talking about the research that EPA does. I'm talking about the science that includes some of their own research, but a lot of other research in making a regulatory decision. And those are sort of two different issues. How they do their research, what type of research EPA should do itself intramurally is one set of issues, which I think is what this statute addresses. The issue I address, and some of my colleagues here, is more how does EPA incorporate science from its own laboratories, but also outside those laboratories in making a regulatory decision. Those are two separate issues. You might want to separate them.
Thank you very much. Gentleman from California, Mr. Rohrabacher is recognized. You want Mr. Hall? It's your turn, but... Okay. Mr. Rohrabacher.
All right. Thank you very much. I'd just like to start out by reading a quote from President Eisenhower in his farewell address. And people always look at that address, and I Googled it up the other night. It's 15 minutes long. I just would recommend you taking a look at the insights of this man who helped defeat the Nazis and save the world from that terrible threat, then came on as leader of our country and did, in retrospect, a pretty good job as President of the United States. But he had an incredible vision of things that were happening, both before he became president and when he was younger, and what it might look like in the future. And he warned us, yes, against the military-industrial complex. Everybody knows that. That's a famous part of his speech. But he also spent just as much time warning us about the corruption of science. And let me read a part of that. The prospect of domination of the nation's scholars by federal employment, project allocations, and the power of money is ever present and is gravely to be regarded. Yet in holding scientific research and discovery in respect, as we should, we should also be alert to the equal and opposite danger that public policy could itself become captive of a scientific technological elite. And we have lots of examples of that since Eisenhower left. And I just know that just in my lifetime, I remember when we didn't eat cranberries for Thanksgiving and Christmas for 2 Christmas because some scientist came up with the idea that it was going to cause cancer. Of course, it didn't cause cancer. We know that, and these aren't things that are necessarily being done intentionally. Maybe the scientist at that moment thinks it's really important. We have outlawed DDT, and there's all sorts of scientific evidence, and I bet the scientific elite got behind this because it became very trendy, because bird shells do indeed become less able to protect the developing bird if DDT is in the environment. But we also know now that DDT kills mosquitoes, and mosquitoes cause malaria. And by making sure we protected birds, a number of hundreds of thousands of birds, we have condemned millions of children in Africa to a horrible death of malaria. Just examples like this where you've got scientists being used basically to determine policy, and a lot of times that policy is wrong. Maybe the science might even be right, but the policy is wrong. And so I'm very sympathetic with Ms. Dudley's suggestion there about. I take it from what you were trying to do is trying to separate policy decisions from scientific research. So the scientists should just be answering to the policymakers as to what the exact science is. Is that what we're saying here today?
I think that's part of it, and that's been accepted since, I think it was 1983, the National Academies of Sciences had issued a report that said, let's separate the risk assessment from the risk management. So that's part of it, and I think some of our statutes don't allow us to do that. But I think then the second part is even in the risk assessment, Professor Marchant was talking about this, even in the risk assessment, you have pure science, but then you also have some of these judgments. And you can't totally separate that, but we should at least make transparent where the science ends.
Well, let's face it, Malthus was supposedly a scientist. I mean, he was the mathematician of his day, and he gave us a chart that said that the entire world would have starved to death 50 years ago if Malthus was correct. And I remember the cyclamates. Remember cyclamates? Here, the industry put hundreds of millions of dollars into developing a synthetic type of sweetener, and somebody said, well, it might cause cancer. Then scientists became a trendy thing. They outlawed it. By the way, they never outlawed it in Canada. 10 years after a research, they found out it wasn't cancer-causing. And what was the problem then? Well, the fact is, high fructose corn syrup was developed in between and put into place. And if you want, and most of us know, I hope this isn't trendy science as well, that high fructose corn syrup isn't really good for people. My wife has outlawed it in our household anyway. So with that said, Mr. Chairman, I want to thank you for making sure you had a secondary follow-up, because it's the EPA decision-making on science that really can affect so many people's lives in a positive way, but also in a negative way. Thank you very much.
Thank you. I recognize the gentleman from New York, Mr. Tonko.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Let me thank the panelists for appearing before the committee. And you've all stated your support for environmental protection, but you have also offered harsh criticism for EPA's science and EPA's regulations. Could you offer specific illustration of one specific example of good regulation and one specific example of bad regulation?
You want me to start? I'll start. At EPA, I would say the removal of lead from gasoline, that was one that was really based on clear science and then a clear risk management analysis as well. So the science informed the risk assessment, which informed the risk management regulatory decision, and I think that has brought about dramatic improvements. It's probably the biggest success story at EPA. I think the ambient air quality standards are an example of decisions where we do blur the lines between the science and the policy, and that, frankly, it's because I'm not blaming EPA for that. It's the statute that says EPA must make its decision based on public health and public health alone, and yet in the analysis, there's nowhere to. If you have a linear dose response curve that goes to zero, how do you set a standard that's requisite to protect public health and choose anything other than zero? And so what that forces, it forces EPA to kind of wave their hands and make up all kinds of reasons why they're setting a non-zero standard. And so the real reasons for making that decision are obscured.
Dr. Moghissi.
I'm glad you asked. The date is 1970-something when Toxic Substances Control Act was passed. And up to that time, there were no regulations relative to manufacturing of chemicals. And for all practical purposes, the industry could just release chemicals as they saw fit. The regulations were excellent. They came at the right time and resulted in limitations of what the chemical industry could do. And they proved to be cost-effective, and they were useful. Let me give you a bad one. The date is about 1990-something. There's a place called Waste Isolation Pilot Plant in New Mexico, and in which radioactive waste from reprocessing of weapons, transuranic waste, is disposed. Now, the way it is set up, transuranic waste and chemical waste, hazardous waste were combined. That's just the way it worked. And the poor guys had to go and open up this highly radioactive 55 container and analyze for chemicals. A chemical disposal facility is intended to have, I don't know, maybe a couple of 100 years. Waste isolation pilot plant is intended for 1,000 years. And yes, they had to do it. And finally, my organization, based on the request of someone some government agency, we developed a panel which included the guy who wrote the hazardous waste regulations, and they said, don't do it. But the EPA had problems, and finally the only way it happened was the Congress, through appropriations, said, you can't do it. So that was the end of it. And it saved a lot of human life, a lot of enormous cost. Can you imagine the requirements for opening up the dam? Excuse my French. the 55-gallon container and the radioactive waste to analyze for a little benzene or something like that? Good two examples.
Dr. Green.
Thank you. Well, I think I'd make 2 points. I agree with Susan, first of all, that Professor Dudley, that the handling of lead is an example of good regulation. We had an event at AEI not that long ago in which that was discussed at some length. And I would say there's also a distinction that needs to be made between early rounds of the National Ambient Air Quality Standards and later rounds, in that you're going to have a greater return on your investment when you're chasing higher levels of pollutants and you have higher level effects. The wisdom of a regulation can go from being good to being bad based on the rounds and evolution of the problem. And a lot of times the regulations are not written with end feedback evolutionary mechanisms in mind to prevent that from happening. And so I think it's an important distinction to be made. As for things that go wrong, it's not just EPA, but you have things with asbestos regulations which required greater exposures, that walls had to be torn open that otherwise humans wouldn't be exposed to, that created risks for the cleanup workers, for example, that would have to be offset against the risks that people might face in exposure to it. And finally, approach matters, which is, I might agree with you that we might agree on there's a problem, and we might even agree that there's a regulatory or a need for the government to intervene to address that problem. But there's a choice of options. I can go with an eco-tax, I could go with a direct emission fee, or I can go with a regulation or a technology standard, or picking and choosing an approach or technology approach. And those are going to have different cost and benefit return on investment profiles as well as influencing people's lives and individual liberty and commercial liberty and so forth.
I think most environmental regulations have done more good than harm. My main concern is how they're explained to the public and really at the margins. But I think if you're looking at beneficial ones, you'd have to start with the ambient air quality standards. They have by far the biggest bang for that we've spent on them. And particularly, I think there's some issues with the ozone one at the margin, but particulate matter and lead and carbon monoxide have all been tremendously beneficial. The sewage treatment program's been tremendously beneficial. So there's a lot of examples of good ones. There are ones that are bad, and I think it's interesting looking at the bad ones to see where it went wrong. But I mean, my favorite is one the D.C. Circuit struck down a chemical manufacturing versus EPA case about a decade ago, where EPA modeled these high-risk chemicals under the hazardous air program, and one particular chemical is basically a solid at the modeling characteristics that EPA used, and the company, gave them clear data that was the fact that there would be no exposure, and EPA simply ignored it and says you've got to be regulated like this because we're going to assume that at this level, at this temperature, you're not a solid. And it was just clearly scientifically wrong, and yet they just went ahead with the regulation anyhow. Unfortunately, the D.C. Circuit struck it down as lacking any plausibility in science whatsoever.
Thank you very much. The Chairman, Mr. Hall, is recognized.
Thank you very much. Ms. Dudley, you're exactly right when you delegate authority solely on science. I don't think there's anybody in here that disagrees with that. But I know you didn't intend to say that you can ignore good and reliable science. And I respect every one of you that are here. You're a professor of public policy, regulatory science, enterprise, Center for Law, Science, and Innovation. You're not with the administration. And I think Dr. Green did his best to compliment the Environmental Protection Association, but I didn't read enough of it, and I quit reading it when I gathered that. I talked just a minute about the EPA. Maybe, I don't know how long ago, but I was here when we passed the Clean Air Act and the Clean Water Act, and we gave the EPA a place in the sun in that legislation and had expectations that they would use science and use other knowledge that was available to them. And it's my opinion that they've deviated from that, and they've deviated it to the extent that it's very damaging to institutions in my district and all across this country. Dr. Moghissi, in September, I sent the EPA a letter requesting information on their integrated planning model. You all call it the IPM. This is a model that the agency used to analyze the cross-state air pollution rule. You're familiar with that, aren't you? And the assumptions driving this model have never been made public, and to our knowledge, the model itself has never been peer-reviewed. How would the IPM model fare if evaluated by the ethics principle of regulatory science that you describe in your testimony?
What they would have to do, they would have announced the assumptions, every piece of an assumption, and I'm familiar with half of them, but not all of them. Many of those assumptions on the extreme side of the scientific business, they would have to say, what would happen if I make a different assumption on the other side of it? Mm-hmm. And how would the conclusion be different? That would be subject to independent peer review. And if I might add, the peer review says you have to be qualified if you are a peer reviewer. You do not may have conflict of interest. But those who have a stake in the outcome of the peer review may not be peer reviewers, nor may participate in the selection of the reviewers. And in my opinion, that's very often violated. Therefore, it is imperative that the Sunshine Act that I'm suggesting open up to the public. Let them, if the people know what they are doing, as you suggesting, if the model, the assumptions in the model are described, if the judgments are described, if alternative assumptions and judgments are described, and the conclusions that are from it described, then the role of the science is done. The next step is the administrator has to go and say, I picked up this because, in my opinion, this is the right choice. This is my opinion as an administrator of the EPA. That's what I would like to do. It's not pro-regulation. It's not anti-regulation. It's just the truth in regulation.
How would the IPM model fare if evaluated by the ethics principle of regulatory science that you describe in your testimony? How would that be?
Thank you, sir. Thank you, sir.
If you can't knock that one out of the park, I'll give you another one in a minute.
In other words, the peer review must say, include in the peer review that I picked up this assumption, I picked up these alternatives, these are why I did it. I did not, if I included a societal objective in it, that's why I did it. Could I have done without it? The openness, the transparency is the key issue. Again, it does not change anything in terms of pro-regulations or anti-regulations. What it says is you should tell the public that you gentlemen over there are a hell of a lot more qualified on policy than I am. And I'm a scientist. And I'm not necessarily all that modest. But I'm not qualified. You are qualified. So therefore, in my opinion, these ethical requirements, and it took several years to develop them, are very important to comply with.
IPM is the model that the agency used to analyze the cross-state air pollution rule, as you know, and it affected adversely all over this country, but it particularly affected entity in my committee at Mount Pleasant, Texas, a luminant case. I think you may be familiar with that, but it cost them 500 jobs almost immediately. And it's my opinion, and my opinion alone, that there was such an outcry from that and how it affected a lot of other states, not just luminant, that they began to make some kind of a realization that they might have made a mistake in leaving and bypassing or ignoring some science and arriving at their opinions. We had an EPA assistant administrator, Gina McCarthy, here before us, and when she was pressed for some reason, she did something there and gave some ruling without her applying the proper science to it. She gave us the arrogant answer, we're not in the business of creating jobs. And I left her space to make an apology for that in the testimony, but it never came. And that's what we get from EPA today. Should EPA continue its path to implement the cross-state rule, given that the IPM model is not peer-reviewed and is not transparent, or should EPA discontinue their current efforts until such a time that the IPM model is peer-reviewed and transparent? Is that the way you think they ought to go?
The way to remedy that, sir, to pass the Regulatory Science Sunshine Act, to impose upon the EPA, they have to be transparent. They have to pass the peer review consistent with the requirement of ethics of the regulatory science. The people are not stupid. The people understand it. The arrogance of some of the science within or in policymaker, I know better what's best for the country. No, the people of the United States know what's best for the country. And therefore, the Sunshine Act opened up to the public. And again, this is not pro or against regulations. It just opens it up.
Thank you very much.
My time's up. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you very much. You recognize the gentleman from California, Mr. McNerney.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Chairman, I'd like to address one of the issues you bring up often is hydraulic fracturing. The EPA was authorized by Congress in 2010 to open up a study in hydraulic fracturing and its potential impact on groundwater. Now, maybe you disagree with that decision, but we saw when we were discussing nuclear waste a few weeks before that, if the public doesn't buy into a procedure in their district, you're going to end up in courts. There's going to be fights. It's going to go nowhere. And so it was wise, I think, for Congress to authorize the EPA because there is a groundswell of public concern about potential pollution from hydraulic fracturing. So if we can prove that it's not a problem, that's good. If we can prove it is a problem, it needs to be done. And so I just wanted to address your continued concern about that. Now, about the issue that we're discussing today, I didn't necessarily disagree with what was said by the panel. I think Mrs. Dudley's use of the word charade regarding policy and science was needlessly inflammatory. But one of the things that I kept hearing was that we need to have science separated from policy. And an example we have of that, in the 1990s, we had the Office of Technology Assessment. It did an unbiased work. And the then Speaker of the House of Representatives, Newt Gingrich, disbanded that organization because, in my opinion, he didn't like what they were doing. So separating science and policy is not really possible in this sort of political environment. I don't know exactly where to go from there, but the objective of this hearing is to decide how we should empower or enable scientific research to inform regulatory decision-making. Now, one of the things that Mrs. Dudley says is, and all of you, I think, really, is that science is not certain, and that's for sure. Science is never certain, but there are ways to include probability assessments in scientific judgments, and there are statistical tools that can be used in decision-making with uncertainty. I'm a mathematician, so I'm aware of those tools. So what do you say, Mrs. Dudley, in terms of using that approach, because we can never have absolute certainty in science?
I think that's an excellent suggestion, and the national academies have suggested that regularly to improve the quantitative uncertainty analysis for regulations that are likely to have the biggest impacts or for assessments that are likely to have the biggest impacts. And the reason that's so important is then you make more transparent what the assumptions that are going into that risk assessment are. So I think that's key.
So we don't have to have absolute certainty. We can't have absolute.
No, you can't.
But we can make decisions in the absence of absolute.
Absolutely. I don't think anyone suggests that you have to wait for certainty. In fact, the science charade, I did not mean it to be inflammatory. It's actually a phrase that Wendy Wagner coined a decade or so ago in an excellent article. And I've been doing some research lately that all the incentives in the regulatory system are to perpetuate that charade. And the charade is that we make the pretense of that something is based solely on science, and then we're hiding the real decisions. And what you're suggesting is a way to step back and make that clear. Here are our assumptions, and here's the range of assumptions we could have used, and if we do this quantitative uncertainty, that makes transparent for everyone. It's excellent.
Okay. Mr. Green.
I think your point is very, very well taken. It's also important for people to understand that science is provisional, and that science has a culture which is rather different than the culture of policy. And that is, science is provisional in that everyone understands that a paper that they put out one week can be overturned next week, and the consequence is simply that somebody goes back to the lab. But once you start entraining the scientific findings into a regulatory process, it's often hard to reverse the train. And so, as I was saying before, I think some feedback mechanisms and evolutionary mechanisms that allow for the provisionality of science to feed back and have faster impacts on slowing the train or changing the course of direction would be very important. One last comment, which is I think the transparency issue is very important. Proprietary models are a real problem when you have an agency that's running proprietary health models or having proprietary data that can't be analyzed from outside. It's very hard to assess whether or not the work itself really does reflect science or reflects simply assumptions that are put into models no one can see.
Okay, Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
Thank you very much. Thanks. Yeah, we have a little more time left, so we're going to have a second round of questions, but just limit it to 3 minutes per member, and I'll have the first questions in the second round. Dr. Green, the Federal Advisory Committee Act, which governs EPA's Science Advisory Board, and CASE Act, the Clean Air Scientific Advisory Committee, requires that advisory peer review panels be, quote, fairly balanced in terms of the points of view represented. However, a recent hearing raised a number of issues related to these panels. For example, 5 of the 7 standing members of KSAC have recently received EPA funds. They are actually direct recipients of funds. And the current KSAC Particulate Matter Review Panel includes 9 scientists who had previously recommended lowering the annual standards. So, maybe have a little bit of policy preference there. Do you think the requirement for balanced scientific advice is met by these EPA committees at this point in time?
As I have seen them, I'm not. I guess the answer I would say is probably not. But the question is, how do you best represent balanced points of view? And I think a lot of the times the discussion comes down in the wrong framework. That is, it's industry views versus agency views, or university views versus private sector views, public sector versus private sector views, without a recognition that there's expertise on both sides. The person doing applied chemistry at Kodak or at a chemical company has very detailed, specific information that could inform a policy process. The question is, do we capture those people who have direct field experience as much as we capture the expertise of people with university experience or an agency culture or leaning? From what I've seen of review panels, I've rarely seen one you were mentioning the ranking member was mentioning the lack of balance on the panel here. Imbalanced panels seem to be the norm rather than balanced panels.
Thank you very much. Professor Dudley, earlier this year, the U.S. EPA's long-awaited study of formaldehyde's toxicity was panned by the National Academy of Sciences panel that sharply disagreed with the agency's conclusions and declared the effort in need of, quote, substantial revision. The panel stated, and I'm quoting from their statement, overall, the committee found that EPA's draft assessment was not prepared in a logically consistent fashion, lacks clear links to an underlying conceptual framework, and does not sufficiently document methods and criteria used to identify evidence for selecting and evaluating studies. Now, NAS added that EPA's chemical assessments have consistently displayed these problems in recent years. How should the EPA modify the integrated risk information system in response to the criticisms that were raised by NAS?
I think the NAS report itself gave some very constructive suggestions, and it comes back to the transparency that we've all been talking about, both you and your panel today. So more transparency so that we understand why decisions are made, because there are a lot of those assumptions. Which studies do you choose? Which models do you choose? What default assumptions do you use? If we can make that more transparent and perhaps follow Dr. Moghissi's, which I need to spend the hour to learn the details of, follow those steps to make sure that we really do understand the range of assumptions you could make that transparent. I think that would address the Academy's concerns.
Thank you very much. Mr. Miller.
Ms. Dudley, the IRIS procedures have changed at least 3 times in the last decade. There was sort of an early Bush administration procedure, a late Bush administration procedure that I think you were the principal author of, and then the Obama administration has developed their own procedures. The criticisms of the formaldehyde decision, or the formaldehyde decision that was criticized by GAO, under which set of procedures was that decision made?
First, let me say I was not the architect of the procedures. That was EPA. It was EPA who changed the IRIS procedures. So, we could talk about this privately if we'd like, but I assure you, I may not be under oath, but I will go under oath and tell you that's true. And OIRA was not the architect of that. I'm not sure. I'm sure it was over time. I don't know that the new procedures will change that, because the procedures really were how you do the vetting interagency and with the public. And that certainly helps. I think engaging a broader perspective will address some of the concerns, but I won't use all your time.
All right, Dr. Marchant, you discussed institutional biases at EPA and said that it distorted mixed science and policies and values into one big mess. But there are panels, review panels, advisory panels that have been established by statute, and I think maybe by EPA on their own, to review scientific research activities. What role can do those advisory panels play, those boards play? Are they functioning? and how can they or do they separate science and policy decisions?
I think they do help. They're sort of an intermediate step to have sort of an independent scientific check on what the agency is doing to give them advice. I do think they're still somewhat beholden to the agency as opposed to a completely separate independent institute that's basically made up of career scientists who work for that institute rather than being appointed by an agency. I also think that those committees should not be making recommendations on policy. I don't think they should be telling the EPA what the level to set the standard. They should be telling them what the science says, and then it's the agency's job to set the standard. The scientists shouldn't be making those policy decisions. They aren't policy experts.
Okay. Dr. Green, same question to you.
Well, I think Dr. Marchant's point is exactly right, which is you do need review agencies. You need review panels. But it's difficult not to have them be captured or capture the agency that they're associated with if there is some sort of benefit, whether it's a prestige benefit or an influence benefit or a potential grant benefit or any kind of interaction. It's hard to separate those things out. It's not that it can't be done, and I think that the important thing is that they should simply draw the line at saying, here's what we read the science as, it's all published, it's all public, here's how we interpret it, here's what we think the science says is, and it's not our job to say what should be or what should be done. And they should hand that should be a clearly a clearly political decision by the administrative side of the agencies. We did, but instead we have previous decisions that were defended on as being the decision is dictated or driven by the science. It's science-based, it's science-driven. The science says we must X, and science can never tell you what to do. It can only tell you what is. And so I guess one of my only suggestions would be we should ban the phrase, the science says we must, from statutory language entirely, and we might get improvement that way.
Thank you very much. Gentleman from California, Mr. Rohrbach.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. And let me just note, and again, this is this is not a scientific analysis of what's been said. It might be impacted by my political opinions, but I would suggest the Office of Technology Assessment was not eliminated by Newt because it was doing things that he didn't like. No, I was here when that happened. We tried to balance the budget, and that was one of the years that we were able to balance the budget by eliminating what we thought were extraneous groups that were not doing the job that they were doing, was not worth the money that was being paid. In the case of Office of Technology Assessment, they would often give us their assessment a year or two after we requested it, when it was no longer necessary to hear their opinion, but they weren't doing a good job. And at least that's what those of us who voted to eliminate that part of our budget in order to have a balanced budget. I also don't believe that there was ever a groundswell of public concern for fracking that it might impact on the groundwater. There was a groundswell among liberal politicians who controlled the House at that time, again, another scientific expertise by politicians, who wanted to prove that, or who believe that global warming is caused by CO2 and that they would do anything they could to prevent more availability of oil and gas because that would create CO2, would create global warming. Again, a political decision. Let me ask my one question, which is, at a recent hearing, I asked Dr. Paul Nanis, I guess pronounce it, I'm sorry if I mispronounce it, the Assistant Administrator for EPA's Office of Research and Development, and the EPA Science Advisor, I might add, about new regulations for perchlorate. And this was basically, I asked him, in the face of decades of scientific work from the national academies and other reputable scientific institutions, saying that no such regulation was needed, why were they moving forward? And his answer simply, well, it implied that a scientific basis was not required for EPA to create regulations. I'd like to hear from the panel just whether or not, we don't have much time, but a yes or no, whether you think that whether or not EPA should require a scientific basis to create a new regulation. Just a yes or no, or whatever the quick thoughts are.
If they want to develop a regulation, which is which is based on science, that would be absolutely necessary. How else do you do? The gentleman over there is a physician. How else do you go and treat someone with a medicine if you don't know what the medicine is? So therefore, the disease and medicine are related to each other. And therefore, without having the scientific foundation, the regulation is arbitrary.
I would agree. I would agree with that. I think you need to have a scientific foundation. That being said, you could envision some cases where the science is so clear that something is damaging that setting the level could be based on other factors than that. You may not actually have to question the science. But I agree. The key thing is, if you're going to regulate, you need a rationale for regulation. If it's about environmental protection, that suggests you've measured something that needs protecting, you've determined what needs to be done in order to protect it. All of those are scientific activities, and without them, it's hard to see how you have a rationale for your action as opposed to simply acting randomly. Why couldn't they then just pass any regulation they want to on any subject if there's no rationale or no linkage to their mission?
Correct.
I think, personally, that's a terrible idea to base it not on science, but I'm glad that they would explain it more honestly, if there isn't science to back it up, to be explicit about that rather than trying to say that there is science. So now we can all evaluate it and make our own judgment whether that's a good regulation or not. And I would think it wouldn't be if there's no science to back it up.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, gentleman from New York, Mr. Tonko.
I'm set.
Well, thank you. Okay, I want to thank the witnesses for their valuable testimony and the members for their questions. The members of the subcommittee may have additional questions for the witnesses, and we ask you to respond to those in writing as quickly as possible. The record will remain open for 2 weeks for additional comments from members. The witnesses are excused. Without objection, the hearing is recessed, subject to call of the chair to a date to be determined for a second day of testimony for this hearing. All right, thank you very much.
I wonder if I should be early for the meeting.